The winter of 1811 had frozen Marlow Fen harder than anyone could remember. Snow buried fences, ice sealed the river. The wind screamed across the marshes without mercy. Meg Ellison was 20, far too young, already carrying responsibilities meant for older shoulders. Her father had grown too ill to run the mill, so she did. She hauled grain, split firewood, kept the wheel turning, and prayed each week that the roof would hold one more season. Late one bitter afternoon, arms full of firewood, she noticed something beside the outer mill wall. A shape, half covered in drifting snow. She dropped the wood instantly. A man, collapsed, barely conscious. His lips had gone that frightening shade of blue-white that meant the cold had almost won. She didn't stop to wonder whether he was dangerous, or lying, or pretending. She simply hooked his arm across her shoulders and dragged him inside. Somehow, strength she never knew she possessed carried him through the mill door, into the little room behind the workshop, toward the only warmth the building offered, the fire. Hours later, his eyes opened, slowly, blinking against the flames. His first words surprised her. "I'm sorry." His teeth still chattered violently. "I never intended," a shaky breath, "to trouble you." Meg knelt beside him, struggling to pull frozen boots from stiff feet. "You'd troubled the whole parish considerably more," she tugged harder, "by dying against my mill wall." One boot finally came free. She frowned at his feet. "Hold still." He looked confused. "Your feet have turned entirely the wrong color for conversation." Despite himself, he almost smiled. She wrapped him in every blanket she owned, fed him the last of the broth simmering for her father, then stayed awake beside the fire while the storm battered the shutters all night. Near midnight, his color slowly returned. "You didn't have to do this." His voice was stronger now. "I don't even know who I am." Meg stirred the fire. "I know enough." He watched her. "Oh? You're a man who nearly froze to death outside my door." She looked at him. "That's all I need to know tonight." A quiet silence settled between them. "The rest," she smiled gently, "can wait until morning."
"You have until the end of the week, Miss Ellison." Cornelius Vance spoke as calmly as a man discussing the weather. "I am not an unreasonable man." He laid the foreclosure notice neatly across the mill office desk, smoothing one corner with his gloved hand, as though the paper itself deserved more care than the woman standing before him. Meg kept her palm pressed firmly over the document, as if hiding the words could somehow change them. "My father's debt was owed to the bank." Her voice remained steady. "Not to you." Vance smiled politely. "Your father's debt was purchased by me." A pause. "Entirely legally." He adjusted his cuffs with effortless precision. 3 months ago." Another pause. "Along with several other debts belonging to men unfortunate enough not to survive." Meg's stomach tightened. "I am fully entitled to collect." His smile never moved. and I believe I've been exceptionally generous, allowing you until harvest. I've raised half. Half, he replied smoothly, is not the whole. Silence. And the whole, his eyes drifted toward the mill windows, is what the note requires. He clasped his hands behind his back and slowly wandered toward the great water wheel outside. I already have a buyer interested in the water rights. His tone remained conversational. If operating the mill proves inconvenient. He looked back at her. I would rather purchase it from you willingly. A faint smile. It would spare us both the unpleasantness of a formal seizure. Meg met his gaze. There is nothing kind, her jaw tightened, about buying a dying man's debt simply to steal his livelihood. For the first time, Vance's smile thinned. Business, Miss Ellison, a small shrug, is rarely kind. He reached for his hat. It is simply business. He turned toward the door and stopped, because someone stood there, tall, motionless, blocking the autumn light pouring into the mill. Meg's breath caught instantly. No, it couldn't be. She knew that silhouette. She had spent 7 years convincing herself she'd imagined how clearly she remembered it. Mr. Vance. The voice was low, controlled, powerful enough that Vance turned immediately. For the first time since arriving, his confidence cracked. I believe, the stranger stepped fully inside, we have business to discuss. Another measured step. Before you finish yours with Miss Ellison. Meg stared. 7 years disappeared in a heartbeat. Those eyes, deep blue, exactly the same. Only now, faint threads of silver touched the dark hair at his temples. Time had changed him. Responsibility had changed him. But she knew him. She would have known him anywhere. Your Grace, Vance's voice tightened. I wasn't informed you had any interest in this property. You weren't, because 3 minutes ago, he removed his gloves, until my steward happened to mention that Cornelius Vance held a foreclosure note on the Ellison Mill. His gaze settled on Meg. I do now. A pause. I do now. Meg's fingers slowly lifted from the foreclosure notice. She barely noticed. Her heart pounded too loudly. 7 years, 7 long years. The starving traveler she had rescued from the snow stood before her, wearing the signet ring of the Duke of Ashcombe. 7 years earlier. In my presence, another, and you will not attempt to acquire further debts belonging to my tenants in this parish or any other. Silence. Do we understand each other? Vance's jaw worked once, twice, calculating. Meg could practically see the numbers moving behind his eyes. Profit lost, profit remaining, power gone. At last he bowed stiffly. Perfectly, Your Grace. He left within the hour. The transfer signed. His composure never fully recovered. And when the mill door finally closed behind him, an almost unbearable silence settled over the room. Meg stared at the foreclosure note, then at Julian, then back at the note. Gone, just like that. 7 years of struggle, one terrible week of fear. Gone. You kept my name, she said quietly. Julian's expression softened. I kept much more than your name. He leaned lightly against the desk. I kept the color the fire threw against the wall behind you that first night. Meg's breath caught. I kept the sound of the wind against your shutters. Another pause. And I kept the taste of broth I have never once, in 7 years of dining at tables far finer than yours, managed to forget. Something raw rose unexpectedly in her chest. You could have written. The words escaped before she could stop them. Julian went still. In 7 years, she said more quietly, a letter would have cost you nothing. He looked at her for a long moment, then answered with disarming honesty. For the first year, I wasn't certain I would survive becoming what I'd become. A faint smile without humor, and by the time I did survive it, he exhaled slowly. I no longer knew how to write to the woman who had saved a beggar's life, now that I was a duke who could not unbecome one. Meg's eyes stung unexpectedly. I didn't save you to be repaid. I know. His voice softened. That is precisely why I could not stop thinking about you. Silence. Every kindness I have seen in 7 years of titles and obligations came attached to a ledger, a beat, a favor expecting another favor, a courtesy seeking advantage. He looked at her steadily. You gave a dying stranger broth, blankets, and a fire. His voice dropped, and asked for absolutely nothing. Meg stared at him. This man she had dragged from the snow at 20, now 27, silver touching his temples, a duke's authority settled into his shoulders, and yet somehow still unmistakably the same half-frozen man who had apologized for troubling her. She swallowed, then said softly, You told me you'd remember. A small, almost disbelieving smile touched her mouth. I didn't realize you meant 7 years' worth of remembering. If this reunion is getting to you, subscribe now, because the next part is where 7 years of remembering finally turns into something neither of them can pretend is only gratitude anymore. Julian smiled, a quiet smile, the kind that belonged only to her. I meant considerably longer than 7 years. He held her gaze. If you'll allow me the chance to prove it. Meg felt her heart stumble, because she believed him. She simply did not yet know how difficult believing him would become. The next trouble did not come from Cornelius Vance. His scheme had collapsed the moment a duke walked through the mill door. He accepted his payment, collected what remained of his pride, and disappeared from Marlow Fen within the week. No, the real battle arrived from Ashcombe Hall. It wore silk instead of wool, perfume instead of greed, and answered to the name Lady Prudence Ashcombe, Julian's aunt, the woman who managed the estate's social affairs since his father's death. She had very firm opinions about duty, about bloodlines, about what a duke owed his family, and none of those opinions included Meg Ellison, a mill owner's daughter,
Lady Prudence repeated the words as though tasting something unpleasant. Julian stood across from her in the morning room. Yes, Prudence folded her hands. She spends her days hauling grain sacks. A pause. Balancing mechanical accounts. Another. I understand the sentiment, Julian. Her smile carried no warmth. Truly. She waved one elegant hand. The beggar, the fire, a most touching little story. She leaned forward. But touching stories do not sit comfortably at the head of a ducal table. Silence. Our family has endured enough scandal these past years. Her eyes sharpened. We do not need another. There is nothing scandalous, Julian answered calmly, about marrying the woman who saved my life. Prudence sighed. There is everything scandalous, her voice hardened, about a duke marrying a tradeswoman. She has flour under her nails. She owns a mill. She has no society, no connections, no suitable lineage. She met his eyes. The ton will never see gratitude. They will see desperation. They will say you could not secure a bride of proper standing. Her lips tightened, and they will say it loudly. Then let them. Silence. I did not survive freezing to death. A pause. I did not spend a year believed dead. Another. Only to arrange the rest of my life around whispers heard over expensive dinners. Prudence looked away first, but the whispers came anyway. Meg felt them the moment she entered Ashcombe Hall. 3 weeks later. She had accepted an invitation to what Julian described as a small family dinner.
He stared into the fire for several long seconds, then finally said, "My name is Julian." She nodded. "I'm Meg." A pause. "Meg Ellison." He repeated it softly, as though committing it to memory. "Thank you, Meg Ellison." His blue eyes met hers. "For a kindness I have absolutely no way to repay." She shrugged. "I didn't help you to be repaid." Something changed in his expression, something she wouldn't understand until years later. "I know." His voice was almost a whisper. "That," a small pause, "is exactly why I'll never forget it." Julian remained at the mill for 3 days, long enough for the blizzard to break, long enough to regain his strength. He worked beside her each day. He knew nothing about milling, nothing about gears or grinding stones, but he learned quickly, worked hard, complained never, and despite the rough clothes he wore, there was something undeniably refined about him. Not arrogance, habit, the quiet habits of someone raised differently. On the morning he left, Meg wrapped fresh bread in cloth and pressed it into his hands. "You'll need this." He accepted it carefully, then paused at the doorway. Morning mist drifted across the thawing fields. He looked back. "I will remember this." She smiled. "It was only bread." He shook his head. "No." His blue eyes held hers one last time. "It was far more than bread." A pause.
Whatever becomes of me, his voice grew quiet, I want you to know. Another pause. I will remember you. Then he walked away, down the frozen lane, into the morning fog. Meg watched until he disappeared, never imagining, not even once, that the hungry man carrying her bread into the snow would one day return as the Duke of Ashcombe. If you're already piecing together who Julian really was, let me know in the comments by typing 7 years before the reveal finishes. And if you love heartfelt aristocratic romances where kindness changes destinies, don't forget to subscribe, because what happens next has been 7 years in the making. I mean to tell you, Julian's voice remained calm, that 7 years ago, during the worst winter storm this valley had seen in a decade, I was a penniless younger son, believed by my own family to have drowned somewhere on a ship bound for the colonies. Silence filled the mill. Vance stared. Meg forgot to breathe. Julian continued. I had been disowned after a quarrel with my father. A small pause. The details are irrelevant. His blue eyes shifted briefly to Meg. What matters is that I was walking this county half-starved, without prospects, without money, and very nearly without a future. Another pause. I collapsed against the outer wall of this mill. His voice lowered, and Miss Ellison, he looked at her fully now, who had every reason to leave a freezing stranger for the parish to deal with in the morning. Meg's throat tightened, carried me inside. A beat. Fed me from a pot she could not spare. Another. And sat awake through the night to make certain I did not die. Vance cleared his throat. A moving story, Your Grace, but I fail to see what bearing this has on a legally executed. I am not finished. Julian did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. Something in the flat quiet of those words stopped Vance instantly. The Duke continued. 3 months after I left this mill, my elder brother died of a fever. Meg's eyes widened. 4 months after that, my remaining brother was killed in a hunting accident. He spoke the tragedies with practiced restraint, as though he had repeated them enough times that grief had learned to sit quietly beside him. 8 months later, my father died believing his line had ended. A long pause. It took nearly a year for his solicitors to find the son he had disowned. His gaze drifted toward the mill wheel outside. A common laborer working under a false name 3 counties away. Then back to Meg, and inform him that he was now the Duke of Ashcombe. The mill creaked softly around them. Nothing else moved. I have been spending 7 years meaning to return here. His voice softened for the first time. To repay a debt I owe a woman who fed a starving stranger and asked nothing in return. Meg looked away, because suddenly the room felt too small. I have been, a faint self-mocking breath, occupied. An estate in disorder, a title I never wanted, responsibilities that kept pulling me farther from a promise made beside a dying fire. He looked back at Vance, and whatever warmth had entered his expression vanished completely. I did not expect, when I finally returned to keep that promise, to find the woman who saved my life 3 days from losing her home. His eyes hardened. To a man who purchased her father's debts specifically to profit from her ruin. Vance swallowed. Julian stepped forward. I will be purchasing this note from you, Mr. Vance. Calm. Final. At whatever price you paid for it, plus a sum I consider fair compensation for your trouble. A beat. You will be signing the transfer this afternoon.
I expected a woman living upon a romantic debt. She gave the smallest shake of her head. I did not expect a woman capable of managing this estate better than half the stewards currently employed. She could, Julian answered without hesitation. His voice carried absolute certainty. I knew it the first night. Everyone looked toward him. I watched her keep a mill alive while a storm nearly claimed both of us. He smiled at Meg. I've simply spent 7 years waiting for everyone else to discover what I already knew. Lady Prudence did not surrender overnight. Women who spent decades defending old traditions rarely did, but something had changed. Over the following weeks, skepticism became curiosity. Curiosity became respect. Respect slowly became admiration. Meg moved through Ashcombe Hall exactly as she had moved through the mill, quietly, competently, without announcing herself. She found waste, corrected it, found confusion, simplified it, found neglected accounts, balanced them. Even the oldest servants, people who had doubted her from the beginning, found themselves asking her advice, then following it without argument. By winter's end, even Lady Prudence admitted privately, Ashcombe Hall had not been managed so efficiently in years. Julian proposed on the first snowfall, deliberately, carefully, not by accident. He wanted everything to echo the night they first met. A small fire burned in the drawing room. Outside, snow drifted softly across the estate. Inside, the firelight painted the room with the same warm gold it once had inside the mill. Meg noticed immediately. You planned this. Julian smiled. I did. They sat beside the hearth, close enough to feel its warmth. Julian reached for her hand, the one marked with the faint scar she'd earned repairing the mill years ago. His own fingers still carried pale traces of frostbite, 2 old wounds meeting again. He traced the scar gently. I have spent 7 years, his voice barely rose above the fire, trying to find the proper way to thank the woman who saved my life. Meg watched him quietly. At first, he smiled to himself, I thought I owed you a debt, a payment, a favor returned. He shook his head. I was wrong. The only proper repayment. His blue eyes met hers.
is the whole of my life. Silence. I want every year I have left spent proving that your kindness was seen. Another pause. Valued. His voice grew softer and returned. Meg's eyes shimmered. I never doubted you remembered. She squeezed his hand. I only doubted, a breath, whether it mattered to you as much as it mattered to me. Julian's answer came without hesitation. It mattered more than inheriting a title, more than Ashcombe Hall, more than anything that followed. He slowly lowered himself onto one knee before the fire, exactly where she first warmed him 7 years earlier. Meg Ellison, his voice steadied, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life, he smiled, being as faithful a fire for you as you once were for me? Meg looked at him, the starving traveler, the reluctant duke, the man who had never forgotten. And suddenly she realized something. The answer had never truly belonged to this evening. It had belonged to that winter night, when she'd opened her door, when he trusted her, when neither of them knew what destiny had quietly begun. She smiled through tears. Yes. Then added with a grin, though I hope you understand, I fully intend to continue managing my own ledgers. Julian laughed, a real laugh, open, warm, freer than she'd ever heard it. I would expect nothing less. He stood, pulled her gently into his arms, and kissed her beside the fire. The same firelight that had first brought two strangers together 7 winters before. They married the following spring, not at the grand chapel of Ashcombe Hall, but in the little parish church at Marlow Fen. Meg's choice. Julian never questioned it. He understood. The story had begun in her village. It deserved to end there. The mill remained hers. She refused to sell it, refused to fold it quietly into the Ashcombe estate. Instead, she trained a young apprentice from the village. Together they kept the water wheel turning. She divided her days between the mill's ledgers and the far larger accounts of a dukedom. Both prospered beneath her care. Every winter thereafter, on the anniversary of the storm that changed everything, Julian insisted on lighting the little hearth in the mill himself. Then they would sit together before the fire, just as they had years before. Only now the broth was richer, the blankets warmer, and neither of them ever feared the cold again. Because they both understood something the world often forgot. The greatest acts of kindness are almost never offered because someone expects a reward. They're offered simply because another human being needs them. And somehow, life has a remarkable habit of returning those moments when you least expect it, 1,000 times over.
She understood the truth almost immediately. This wasn't dinner. It was an examination. Every smile felt measured, every greeting rehearsed, every glance quietly assessing. No one insulted her outright. People of breeding rarely did. They preferred sharper weapons, questions, small corrections, polite humiliations, the sort delivered with pleasant smiles. "You manage the mill accounts yourself," one of Julian's cousins smiled brightly. "How wonderfully resourceful." Meg nodded. "I do." The woman tilted her head. "I simply cannot imagine finding time for such work alongside the usual occupations of a lady." The room became very quiet. Meg recognized the trap. Smile, answer, appear small. She had spent years navigating conversations exactly like this. "I have never enjoyed the luxury of usual occupations." Her voice remained calm. "The mill does not run itself." A pause. "My father became too ill to manage it, so I did." The cousin smiled. "Oh." Another delicate sip of wine. "Of course." The satisfaction beneath those two words was unmistakable. Exactly the admission she'd hoped to extract. Lady Prudence waited, allowing silence to deepen. Only then did she speak. "It truly is a touching story, Miss Ellison. The fire, the traveler, the kindness." She folded her napkin neatly. "But touching stories eventually end." Her gaze settled on Meg. "And then real life begins." Julian's jaw tightened. Prudence continued. "A dukedom requires rather more than balancing mill ledgers. A duchess manages society, diplomacy, guests, hundreds of servants, generations of expectation." She smiled gently. "I ask only because I care for my nephew." A calculated pause. "Have you considered whether you are truly prepared?" Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "For the reality behind the romance." The words landed exactly as intended. The room waited. Meg felt every eye settle upon her. For one dangerous moment, the old instinct returned. The instinct to stay quiet, to shrink, to apologize for occupying space she hadn't been invited to. It was the same instinct she'd fought every day after her father's illness. The instinct men like Vance depended upon. The instinct that whispered, "You're not enough. You don't belong here." She almost listened. Almost. Then another memory surfaced. A winter night, a dying fire, a stranger with blue lips, frozen boots. She remembered pulling those boots free with numb fingers. She hadn't asked permission then. She hadn't waited for approval. She had simply done what needed doing. Courage had never arrived because someone invited it. It arrived because there was no other choice. Meg slowly set down her fork.
looked directly at Lady Prudence, and smiled, not nervously, confidently. "I have managed a working mill, its accounts, its machinery, its water rights, and the wages of every employee." She paused, entirely alone. Another beat. For 4 years. No one moved. My father became too ill to hold a pen, so I signed every contract. I negotiated grain prices. I repaired machinery. I kept families employed. She looked toward Prudence. Most merchants assumed I was the miller's wife. A faint smile. I corrected them, every single time, and somehow, she let the words breathe, I never lost a contract. Silence filled the table. I have kept one household alive through winters that claimed families with far more help than I possessed. She folded her hands calmly. "You are correct. I have never managed 100 servants." Her smile softened. "Because I have never had 100 servants." A pause. "But leadership," she looked each guest in the eye, "is not measured by how many people stand behind you. It is measured by whether they trust the person standing in front of you." Even Lady Prudence stopped blinking. Meg finished quietly. "I suspect attention, patience, and refusing to let others decide what you are capable of." A final pause. "Are useful skills in any house." The room fell utterly silent. The dining room fell silent. Not the polite silence of good manners, the heavy silence that follows a truth no one expected. Meg looked at Lady Prudence, calm, steady, unashamed. "As for the fire," her voice softened, "I did not pull a freezing stranger from the snow 7 years ago because I imagined it might someday make me a duchess." A pause. "I did it because a man was dying outside my door." She held Prudence's gaze. "And I could never have lived with myself, knowing I had the means to help and choosing comfort instead." Silence. "I would do exactly the same thing tomorrow." Another pause. "For any stranger." Her eyes flickered briefly toward Julian. Duke or beggar, it would make no difference. A faint smile touched her lips. "I have never required a title to know the difference between kindness and its absence." The words settled over the room. "And if that quality is somehow unfit for the head of a ducal table," Meg folded her hands, "then I suspect the fault does not lie with me." No one moved, not even the servants. Julian sat utterly still beside her. Throughout the evening he had watched carefully, ready to defend her if necessary. Now, that careful tension disappeared. Something else replaced it. Pride, open, unhidden. The kind of pride no title could command. Lady Prudence remained silent for several long moments. When she finally spoke, Her certainty had vanished. "You are." She studied Meg anew. "Rather more formidable than the stories suggested." Meg smiled gently. "The stories only ever mentioned the fire." A pause. "They never mentioned everything I became to keep one burning." Something shifted in Prudence's expression. Not affection, not yet, but respect had quietly entered the room. "I confess," Prudence said slowly,